The AyaNeo 3 is the world's first handheld with modular controls. So when you press this button right here, the two control modules, they pop out. You can now flip them around to go for that PlayStation layout or a Wii U layout. And if you want, you can even pull out the buttons themselves and change that ABXY. So as you can see, modularity is the focus here. And it doesn't end here either, because AyaNeo does sell a module pack separately, and that includes 6 other modules. You have ones with trackpads, 6 buttons Sega style, one with a floating D-pad, and a couple that look identical to the default modules but come with a louder and more tactile micro switches instead of membrane. And by the way, even the joystick caps, they just come off, and there are a convex and slightly smaller sticks available as alternatives that are included in that kit. Now all this is very cool, and I'm sure every video you see about this device is going to be focusing on that modularity aspect. But you don't buy a device for just one gimmick, right? Even if the gimmick itself is very nice and very functional, and thankfully the AyaNeo 3 is a lot more than its modularity. Let me explain. If this is your first time here, or in case you just can't remember, my name's Ash, you're watching C4E Tech, and if you do like watching non-mainstream devices such as this, do drop this video a like, hit subscribe, and let's get started. Now before we move on from the modules, here's what else you need to know about them. From AyaNeo's quick settings menu, you can pop each module out individually. And to install a new module, it's plug and play. It's that simple. Well, the AyaNeo 3 comes with 2 modules by default. The 6 Magic module bundle is sold separately for $99. Okay, enough with those modules. Here are some other interesting changes that AyaNeo has made. The buttons, the left and right bumper, the LC, RC, they're all bigger than they used to be. Even the face buttons are bigger, and the grip, it's better on the AyaNeo 3. It feels very comfortable in hand. Now these buttons to the back, they are easy to hit when you want to, but they don't get triggered accidentally. I like the way they've built it. In fact, I'd go as far as to say the ergonomics here, it's the best AyaNeo has ever had to offer. Now the speakers, if you notice, they are front firing and they don't get covered when you hold it in hand. They are very loud. Now to give you some perspective, here's a comparison with the Steam Deck OLED. Have a listen. Very good, right? Now let me quickly walk you through the device. The headphone jack, micro SD card slot, a USB 4 port, and this button to release the modules, they're present at the bottom. This button, by the way, it also helps switch to a keyboard and mouse mode. So if you want to use your sticks as a mouse and other buttons as keyboard shortcuts, you can do that. We then have the AyaNeo buttons, the select and start keys, a multifunction key. Now the sticks, they are Hall sensor, pretty large, have a good range. Now up top, we have another USB 4 port, OcuLink, which is awesome. I mean, check out my video on that eGPU to see what huge a difference OcuLink makes when compared to USB 4. I'll leave a card to that here. We then have the volume keys and the power button, which has got a fingerprint scanner built in. This fingerprint scanner here, to me, I felt it a little slower when compared to, say, the one on the AyaNeo Flip DS. But to be fair, this is a pre-release engineering sample, so hope it gets better with the final release. Now to the back, we've got these 2 switches, which when you turn on, lock the triggers to give you hair trigger functionality. That's great for shooters. Now the whole device is slightly heavier than the Deck OLED, but it is smaller overall and noticeably slimmer despite packing in a very similar 50 watt-hour battery. Now, it's not all roses. There are obviously some cons with the design. For starters, the grip being wider means when you type on the screen, it's very hard to hit the keys at the center. Also, the larger buttons make hitting LC and RC without hand gymnastics impossible, and that's with me having large hands. Now the display here, it's a 7-inch OLED with a 144Hz refresh rate. It's very good to use in general. Games pop really well. That said, there is no VRR. If you want variable refresh, you're going to have to choose that LCD model AyaNeo has to offer. Do note that on this OLED too, when you drop the brightness below 20-30%, there's a reddish hue that kicks in. This is something we've seen on other handhelds like AyaNeo's own Pocket Evo, the AYN Odin Portal, the Zotac Zone. Now this leads me to believe they're all using the same panel from the same manufacturer. Also note that this panel only drops down to 4 nits at its lowest, which is not as low as the Deck OLED. But these are just nitpicks, and once again, to be fair, this panel does run brighter than the Deck OLED if needed. Overall, the display, I'd call it above average in general. and I'd change that rating to very good if you're just talking displays relative to what's actually available on Windows handhelds. Now, of course, there's OLED and LCD options. There are also two SKUs with respect to performance. First, we've got that Ryzen 7 8840U and AMD's newer Ryzen 9 AI HX 370. Unnecessarily long naming. Now that's the one I have, the HX 370, that's what I'm going to call it. And I adore it. Now before we get into the numbers and graphs and all that, a quick disclaimer, I am not an expert on processors with respect to handhelds or anything. So I am learning, I am trying to understand. So if I make any errors, please feel free to point it out in the comments. And also, talking about the comments, read the pinned comment, because I'll make sure I do post clarifications there if I were to F something up. So anyway, in my understanding, AMD has focused more on efficiency this time rather than performance gains with the HX 370. And from a raw performance perspective, this graph should give you an idea of what we are getting. Now these are 3D Mark Time Spy scores. I ran the benchmark on my 8840U AyaNeo FlipDS and the HX 370 AyaNeo 3. And here are two things I want to point out. When the TDP is set to under 10 watts on the FlipDS, it did not stick to it. It kept drawing more, which is why that curve I've started it from 10 watts. And the max I can push the FlipDS to was 30 watts, while the AyaNeo 3 goes up to 35. Now here's what I found very interesting. On the FlipDS, I'd usually run it at 20 to 22 watts for AAA gaming, since it's all diminishing returns after that. But that kind of performance, you get at about 15 watts with the HX 370. Now initially, before I ran these numbers, I was a little bummed out that it's been 6 whole months since the ROG Ally X and its 80 watt-hour battery, and still we are getting only 50 from AyaNeo on their latest flagship handheld. But given the new chip and its efficiency, I'd say the difference in battery life between this and the Ally X, it is there, it's a big difference, but it's not as big as I initially expected it to be. Let me explain, let me show you guys a few practical examples. Let's take Forza Horizon 5. 1080p high settings is what I was running it at. Between both chips, at 30 watts, there's like a 20% improvement in performance on the HX 370. But that's not what interested me. See how the HX 370's 15 watt numbers are pretty much what the 8840U would do at a little over 20 watts. And at 20 watts, the HX 370 does better than what the 8840U does at 30. Now that to me, I found very interesting. Now to verify this is not an outlier, I tested out Shadow of the Tomb Raider 2. This I ran at 1080p highest, and again I got very similar results. The HX 370's 15 watt performance is kind of what you'd get at a little over 20 watts with the 8840U. And at 20 watts, the HX 370 it's beating out the 8840U at 30 watts. Now the Z1 Extreme on the Ally X, it's basically the 7840U, which is pretty much the 8840U minus some AI stuff. So if you were running an Ally X at its max, which is 25 watts, you'd get around 2.5 hours on a single charge. Now if you wanted to run that exact same game at a similar FPS to get a similar experience with the HX 370, on the AyaNeo 3, you'd only need to push the TDP to 17-18 watts, meaning you'd get about 2 hours on a single charge. Now that's what I meant when I said 50 watt hours on this to 80 watt hours on an Ally X. It is a big difference, but it's not as big as the numbers indicate. Of course, the best option would be to get a handheld with the HX 370 and an 80 watt hour battery, but we're gonna have to wait for that at least a little bit, I guess. Now, one more thing is that AyaNeo has a new magnetic vibration motor on this. Usually on AyaNeo devices or Windows handhelds in general, I've never found haptics very impressive. They've had that shrill or blunt kind of haptics. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but if you've used a Windows handheld, I'm sure you'd get it. The AyaNeo 3 is the first time I found genuinely enjoyable haptics on a Windows handheld. Also note that AyaNeo have updated their ISpace to ISpace 3, and this comes with some new features like the device and controller options now being in a tab. There's a new freeze app function, and in general, it's more responsive than it used to be. Now it does carry over all the functionality that we've seen with ISpace 2. So anyways guys, overall the AyaNeo 3, it does feel like an excellent, well put together handheld, but it does also cost a premium. Now, you'd have probably seen headlines that say starts at $699, and that's a nice thing, a nice catchy headline, a clickbaity title to say, I don't deny that. But realistically, that's only for the 8840U. The HX 370 models, even with the early bird price, they start at $1299, which to be honest is pretty steep. And that is not even taking into account the modular controller kit. If you are willing to pay that price though, the AyaNeo 3, it's pretty darn good. and that is my take. What do you think about this handheld? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. Ash, out.